They didn't raise their voices when they decided I was done with my own life. That's the part people never expect. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, because stories like this tend to reach people who understand what it feels like to be quietly erased. My name is Alina Whitmore. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life I believed love looked like trust and family looked like protection. I believed that when you grew older, the people you raised would stand closer, not farther away. The morning it happened was calm, almost gentle. My son sat across from me at the kitchen table, his wife beside him, both of them wearing those careful, sympathetic expressions people use when they think they're being kind. They told me they were worried about my safety. They said the house was too much for me now, that stairs were dangerous, that living alone wasn't responsible anymore. They spoke slowly, as if volume could replace consent. Papers were placed in front of me, forms they said were temporary, just to help manage things while I adjusted. I remember noticing how the sunlight hit the hardwood floors I'd paid for myself, how quiet the house felt, how final their tone already was. I signed because I trusted them, because I didn't want to be difficult, because I never imagined my own children would mistake concern for control. By the end of that week, I was moved into a nursing home I hadn't chosen, in a room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and resignation. They told me it was for my own good. What they didn't tell me, what they never thought I would realize, was that while they were planning to sell my house, the house they believed they owned had never legally stopped being mine. And that quiet misunderstanding was about to change everything. The nursing home wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It existed in that gray space where time slows down and individuality fades. Days were measured in medication schedules, meals served at fixed hours, and polite smiles from staff who meant well but didn't know me. I listened more than I spoke. That had always been my strength. From my window, I could see a narrow strip of sky and a parking lot where families came and went, dropping off relatives with promises they rarely kept. My son and daughter-in-law visited just enough to appear attentive. They asked how I was adjusting, whether the staff was treating me well, whether I felt safer now. I answered calmly, even gratefully, because gratitude disarms suspicion. Inside, though, my mind was working. I replayed the moment I'd signed those papers, remembered which documents they'd rushed me through and which they hadn't mentioned at all. I had spent 30 years working in municipal administration. I knew how systems worked, how authority was transferred, and more importantly, how it was. One afternoon, while a nurse helped me organize my personal belongings, I asked for my old leather address book. Inside it, tucked between phone numbers and faded notes, was the contact information of an attorney I'd worked with years ago. I didn't call him immediately. I waited. People are careless when they think the outcome is already decided. I listened to conversations in hallways, caught fragments of phone calls during visits, pieced together their plans. They weren't just selling the house, they were already spending the money in their heads. And that's when I knew I didn't need to rush. Time, for once, was on my side. When the call finally came, it wasn't dramatic, it was transactional. My daughter-in-law mentioned, almost casually, that a real estate agent had shown interest in the house and that it might be a good idea to streamline things before winter. She spoke as if the decision had already been made, as if my absence from the home had somehow erased my authority over it. I nodded, asked practical questions, and said I trusted their judgment. That was the moment she relaxed. People reveal the most when they believe they've won. 2 days later, I made my own call from the small visitor's room off the main hallway, the one with the outdated magazines and the phone no one seemed to use anymore. The attorney remembered me immediately. He remembered the zoning dispute we'd handled together years earlier, and more importantly, he remembered how meticulous I was. I didn't accuse. I didn't panic. I asked one question: had any deed transfer been legally recorded in the last 6 months? His pause told me everything. There hadn't been. The documents I'd signed gave temporary administrative authority, not ownership. Control, not title. My house was still mine, every inch of it. As he explained the distinction, I felt something steady anchor inside me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an assumption on their part, and assumptions collapse the moment they're tested. I asked him to do nothing yet. No letters, no warnings, just to monitor filings and alert me if anything changed. When I hung up, I returned to the common room, sat among residents watching a game show no one followed, and smiled to myself. They thought distance had weakened me. They didn't realize it had given me perspective and leverage. From that point on, I treated every interaction like a rehearsal where I already knew the ending. My son began calling more often, his tone lighter, almost cheerful, as if this were all a temporary inconvenience on the way to something better for him. He talked about renovations he thought the house might need before listing it, about the market being hot, about how lucky I was to have them handling the stress for me. I asked questions that sounded harmless but weren't. Who was the agent? Which bank was handling escrow? Had they scheduled an inspection yet? Each answer filled in another gap, another step they believed was already secured. Meanwhile, I made friends with the routines of the place I lived in. I learned when the mail arrived, which staff members were discreet, which ones followed rules to the letter. I requested copies of my own records under the guise of organization, building a clean trail of dates and decisions that showed I was alert, competent, and fully present. No one questioned it. People rarely do when an older woman asks for paperwork. They assume it's nostalgia, not preparation. At night, when the halls were quiet and the televisions dimmed, I wrote notes to myself. Names, times, phrases used. I wasn't collecting grievances, I was preserving facts. And with each passing day, the imbalance became clearer. They were moving fast, fueled by confidence. I was moving slow, fueled by certainty. There's a difference. Confidence needs applause. Certainty only needs time. The first offer came sooner than they expected, and that urgency was their undoing. My son arrived one afternoon practically glowing, talking about how this could solve everything, how the buyer was flexible, how closing before the holidays would be ideal. He spoke quickly, words tumbling over one another, already celebrating a future that didn't include me anywhere except as a justification. I listened without interrupting, hands folded in my lap, my face carefully neutral. When he finished, I asked one simple question. Had the buyer's attorney requested proof of ownership yet? The hesitation was brief, but it was there. He waved it off, said it was routine, said they'll handle that. I smiled and told him I was proud of how responsible he'd become. Praise is disarming. It makes people careless. That evening, I called my attorney again and gave him permission to prepare, but not to act, not yet. I wanted the process to advance just far enough that there would be no room for excuses, no claims of misunderstanding. I wanted every signature, every email, every assumption preserved exactly as it was. Over the next week, inspections were scheduled, photos were taken, and paperwork began moving through channels they didn't fully understand. Each step tightened the net, not around them as people, but around their choices. They were committing to a reality that didn't exist, and the law has very little patience for that. Sitting in my small room at the nursing home, I felt no rush of triumph, only a quiet resolve. This wasn't about punishing them. It was about ending the illusion that my absence meant my consent. The call that changed everything didn't come from my son. It came from the real estate agent. She sounded polite, professional, slightly confused, which told me the moment had arrived. She explained there was a minor issue with the title that needed clarification before the sale could move forward. I thanked her for reaching out and asked her to email the details directly to my attorney, whose contact information I provided without hesitation. There was a pause on the line, just long enough for her to realize she had been speaking to the wrong authority all along. Within 48 hours, the momentum my children had built so confidently began to unravel. The buyer's attorney requested documentation that didn't exist. The bank froze preliminary approvals. The agent asked pointed questions no one wanted to answer. And then, inevitably, my son showed up unannounced at the nursing home, his confidence replaced by urgency. He tried to explain, to smooth things over, to suggest there had been a misunderstanding. I let him talk. When he finished, I told him calmly that the house was still mine, that it had always been mine, and that moving me out had not transferred ownership, only revealed intention. He stared at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time, not as someone fragile or confused, but as someone who had been watching quietly while he miscalculated. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply stated facts. And facts, once spoken, have a way of rearranging power without asking permission. The fallout didn't explode, it seeped. That's how real consequences arrive, not with shouting, but with delays, denials, and doors quietly closing. My daughter-in-law stopped calling altogether. My son called twice more, each conversation shorter than the last, his words careful now, rehearsed. He asked if we could reset, if maybe we'd all moved too fast. I told him time hadn't been the problem, assumptions were. Meanwhile, the nursing home administrator requested a meeting. There had been inquiries, she said, about my capacity, questions framed as concern but carrying a sharper edge. I attended the meeting with my attorney present, documents neatly organized, medical evaluations current and unambiguous. The administrator apologized. The file was updated. The questions stopped. That was the moment I felt the ground truly shift, not because I'd won anything, but because the story others had been telling about me no longer fit the evidence. Back at the house, the one they thought was already sold, mail piled up unanswered. Maintenance requests went unresolved. The buyer walked away, and the market cooled. Each small inconvenience traced back to the same source, the absence of a signature they never had the right to expect. I didn't celebrate. I simply watched the balance restore itself. Power doesn't need witnesses, it needs accuracy, and accuracy had finally caught up. Weeks passed, and with them came a quiet reckoning I hadn't anticipated, not from the law, but from within the family itself. Extended relatives began reaching out, their messages cautious, curious, filtered through half-known versions of the story. I answered selectively, never defensively. I told the truth plainly. I had not been abandoned. I had been relocated without consent. I had not relinquished ownership. It had been assumed. And assumptions, I reminded them gently, are not agreements. The responses shifted after that. Some apologized. Others fell silent. A few admitted they'd wondered how it was possible that I'd simply disappeared from my own home without protest. That disappearance, it turned out, had raised more questions than my presence ever had. Meanwhile, my days grew fuller in unexpected ways. Freed from managing everyone else's comfort, I found energy returning. Slow walks in the garden, long conversations with people who listened rather than managed, moments of stillness that felt earned. My attorney kept me updated. No further attempts to sell, no new filings, no quiet maneuvers. The system had settled into place, and so had I. I realized then that the greatest revenge wasn't stopping them. It was no longer being available for exploitation. I hadn't demanded my power back. I had simply stopped lending it out, and once reclaimed, it didn't need defending. The conversation that finally closed the chapter happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon, without witnesses or urgency. My son sat across from me in the visitor's lounge. No papers this time, no plans, no practiced sympathy. Just a man facing the consequences of having mistaken access for authority. He apologized, not dramatically, not convincingly, but honestly enough to matter. He admitted he'd believed I would adjust, that I wouldn't fight, that I would accept comfort over autonomy. I told him I understood why he thought that. I taught him, after all, that I would always make things easier. What I hadn't taught him, what I was teaching now, was that ease has limits. I explained that trust isn't revoked in a moment. It erodes when someone decides another person's life is more convenient without them in it. He asked what would happen next. I told him the truth. I would return home when I chose, on my terms, with safeguards in place that ensured it could never happen again. There would be no punishment, no dramatic separation, just boundaries that no longer bent. He nodded, slowly absorbing the shift. As he left, I didn't feel relief or sadness. I felt something steadier than both, finality, not the end of love, but the end of entitlement. When I finally walked back into my house weeks later, it felt both familiar and new, like returning to a place that had been waiting patiently for me to remember who I was. The air was still, the rooms untouched, the floors holding the quiet echoes of a life that hadn't ended, only paused. I moved slowly, not out of fragility, but intention, opening windows, letting light reclaim the corners where assumptions had once lived. I didn't rush to rearrange anything. I didn't need to prove I was back. I already was. What had changed wasn't the house, or even the people. It was me. I no longer confused love with surrender or concern with control. I understood now that dignity isn't something others grant you when you age. It's something you protect when you realize it's being negotiated away. This wasn't a story about outsmarting my children or humiliating anyone. It was about an old American woman who was quietly written out of her own life and chose to write herself back in with clarity, patience, and unshakable resolve. And once that line was written, it could never be erased again. If this story resonated with you, take it as a reminder. Age does not cancel your authority, and love should never require silence. If you've ever felt decisions were made about you instead of with you, trust your instincts and protect your voice. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're listening from. And for more powerful, realistic stories about dignity, betrayal, and quiet strength, subscribe to Silver Reckoning Hub. Some lessons are learned late, but they're never learned too late.